This past Monday, January 27th, was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. The UN has declared that International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The day passed mostly unnoticed here in the US and as well as in Israel. Yom HaShoah is the more important day to remember the Holocaust. Yet, it was marked in Auschwitz, Poland, with a beautiful ceremony where King Charles was one of the most prominent attendees. They had done a beautiful job. Many of us remember that brick building where the trains would go into the middle. Well, they built a tent, heated tent, obviously, because it's January, with that as the backdrop. So the performance area, the speaking area, was right in front of that, right next to an actual boxcar. It was a beautiful ceremony. Seeing the King of Israel, the King of England there, as well as seeing rabbis, priests from the Catholic Church, priests from the Orthodox Church, all there remembering the Holocaust. And because England, especially led by the royal family, really does take the Holocaust to heart, both William and Kate back in England were reunited in a way with survivors that they have a relationship with. So there were pictures of them actually talking to these survivors because they knew them. And the BBC did a fabulous job at covering this. I wish there was news like this in America, because it was an 18-minute segment. They were able to do a deep dive, including interviewing a British survivor who had made the pilgrimage for the ceremony. Yet the ending of that segment was disconcerting because it focused on Russia. By the way, it was the Russian army, the Soviet army, that liberated Auschwitz that January. But now, with Vladimir Putin in charge, he was not invited to this ceremony because of the Ukraine war. They engage in revisionist history about the Shoah. They too observe January 27th. They too have a memorial in St. Petersburg, but they use January 27th to commemorate the liberation of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, a year later, or a year earlier, I believe, actually. And they commemorate that 27 Russian Soviet citizens were killed in World War II. They do not really acknowledge the Shoah, the mechanic killing of 6 million. Yes, World War II as its own entity needs to be studied and remembered. 50 million world citizens were killed in that war. A big upheaval, we know. But yet the Shoah needs to be remembered on its own, and it is a shame that the liberators of that, one of the centers, the capital, shall we say, of that mechanic killing, do not even acknowledge what happened. And that was one of my greatest fears as I watched what's going on, the ceremonies on Monday, was that Holocaust revision and denial is still alive. We now live in the age of artificial intelligence, and there's an idea that we can make these deep fakes. And my biggest fear is that more people will say, oh, all that evidence you have of the Shoah, that's just artificial intelligence. That is a deep fake. And what's scary is that this existed even before artificial intelligence. Many of us know Deborah Lipstadt, who just finished her tenure as, I would say, sort of the cabinet member fighting anti-Semitism that she spent much of her career addressing Holocaust denial. In 1995, she wrote a book called Denying the Holocaust, and then she had to endure a libel trial against David Irving, who she quoted in the book and attacked in the book as a Holocaust denier. And the libel trial was in England, where she had to prove her innocence as opposed to him having to prove that he was libeled. But going back to her book, she writes about what we call deconstructionist history. She says that it has the potential to alter dramatically the way established truth is transmitted from generation to generation. It can foster a climate in which no fact, no event, and no aspect of history has a fixed meaning or content. Any truth can be retold, she writes. Any fact can be recast. There is no ultimate historical reality. We live in a world, postmodernists, that wants to allow everything to be questioned. 10 years later, in 2005, Richard Feynman wrote, "We absolutely must leave room for doubt, or there's no progress," he says. Everything is up for question. Nothing is really a fact. I disagree. Of course, questions and doubt exist and are necessary. We're even told to ask questions. But there has to be a boundary to doubt. Even if it is, quote unquote, by convention, we need to agree on certainties that cannot be questioned. Otherwise, we can't really have a discourse. In science, pi is irrational. Yet in math, we have to agree to go 3.14 and end there. We can deconstruct history to an extent where everything is relative, but we can't do that. Yes, we can debate motivations and causation of events, but we must agree on indisputable facts, such as the Nazis and the collaborators killed 6 million Jews in machine-like fashion, with no humanity. That is a fact. It cannot be questioned. This week's Torah portion, Bo, has what to say on the things that we need to have conventions of history and time, and that we cannot question them. We read about how there was the Passover of Mitzrayim, of the actual leaving, and then we have to remember this for every single year. In the Chodesh HaAviv, this month of spring. But the year is circular. When exactly is spring, especially when our months are by moon and not by the sun calendar? We have to, by convention, as I mentioned earlier, decide this is the new moon, this is when Passover is going to be, and because the moon cycle doesn't always fit with the sun, we have to have leap years. It is okay for us to say when Passover it is. There's no really exact time. It's when we decide by convention. And when it comes to history, the Torah teaches us that at least in a Jewish context, we must accept the Exodus as fact. The Exodus is our very foundation, and if we were to question that, then Judaism has nothing to stand upon. Many of us know infamously in 2000, the Rabbi David Wolpe went on a pulpit on Passover and said, "I'm not sure the Exodus happened the way that it did." There was a huge brouhaha about it. Thankfully, he's passed on. We've kind of moved on, passed on, but we've moved on from that. We've moved on from that. He is retired. He is now a leader in the Jewish community still. But what was wrong about what he did? He did it in a synagogue context. He did it on Passover, when anyone who even has debates or questions about did 2 million people cross the Sinai Desert, on Passover night, it is an accepted fact. We do not question that veracity, because to be a Jew is to be a slave that left Egypt. Every Passover night, we have to see ourselves as we were slaves that are now free. Maybe in a university, you can question the facts of the Exodus, and maybe it was a smaller group, but it doesn't matter. We leave Egypt every time, every year. Is this hypocrisy to say that the Exodus is ours, even if we might question it? Well, what is Judaism? What is religion? It's about relating to an infinite God that is formless and, yes, timeless. God doesn't measure time. God can't study history because everything is present simultaneously for God. There is no past. There is no future. It's only us humans who live in time, history, and space. And therefore, we can only find God in time and history and space. And so our rituals allow us to do that. We find God by marking holy time. We find God in sacred space, and we find God in sacred history. It was God alone who took us out of Egypt. We celebrate that God acts in history. And what does experience God mean? It means that our mortal senses recognize the infinite presence beyond us and what happens in our history, the invisible hand of God, we like to say. There is much about our world that we must question and we must debate. But then we have the sacred, where we can pause our doubts and bask in at least a temporary surety of God's presence and God's blessing of us all. We say every morning and every night in the Shema, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Asher Hotzeti Etchem Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Liyot Lachem Elohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Emet. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am Adonai, your God. This is truth. Full stop. Shabbat Shalom.